What I'm going to talk to you today about is a subject that I've been very interested in for many years now, Iran. I've made many trips there, about 15 over the last 20 years, and I've worked with Iranians both in a Track 2 sense and also as an official when I was in government, and been very interested in their cultural history and their way of negotiating, and of course, given my interest in security and arms control in their nuclear program. So the basic question that I want to address today over the next 15 minutes or so is, could a nuclear weapon capable Iran be deterred? I want to make it clear that that doesn't mean that I support the idea that Iran should have nuclear weapons. When I was beginning the process of doing the research for this paper, which by the way will be published in the next edition of the Nonproliferation Review, so you don't need to take notes, it's all going to be in the next edition when it comes out. When I was doing research for this paper, I was at a conference in Israel, and I made this sort of preliminary comments that I'm going to make to you now in a more fulsome form, and I was immediately leapt on by a few people as because I was talking about this, that must mean I support them getting the bomb. And that's not true. I mean, I think that we just have to accept, though, that it's very likely that Iran will emerge from the talks that are going on now, that are going to be resumed on May 23rd, with some kind of latent capability, whether we like it or not. And so we have to consider what that means in terms of deterrence and how we might deal with that. That's the spirit in which I approach the paper. If you look at what's been written in the last 5 or 10 years on this question of could a nuclear-capable Iran be deterred, there's a veritable cottage industry of studies and commentaries and opinion pieces. It's quite voluminous. And it covers a very wide spectrum of opinion from people who are what I would call, and I'm showing a bias here, somewhat more level-headed, such as John Abizaid, the former chief of US CENTCOM, who said, look, there are ways to live with a nuclear-capable Iran, to rather apocalyptic people who imagine nuclear war in the Middle East and nuclear terrorism and so on and so forth. There have also been many warnings about Iran's achieving a nuclear weapon capability of some sort, as initiating a proliferation cascade across the Middle East, and all sorts of images have been drawn of, within a few years there'll be several nuclear-capable countries in the Middle East, and so on. So I want to try to get beyond some of that and lay out some thoughts based upon my own, as I say, travels to Iran and my own sort of research and work with Iranians. My view, and I'll state it up front, is that a nuclear weapon capable Iran could be deterred, can be deterred, although it won't be easy, it won't be simple, particularly in the first initial few years of them achieving that capability, for a variety of cultural and political reasons I'll go into. But before I do that, I think we have to look at what I mean by this phrase nuclear weapon capable and what kind of deterrence I'm talking about, because I think those are two important definitional issues. I take the phrase nuclear weapon capable to mean that Iran has solved all or most of the challenges to producing the components of a nuclear explosive device, but has not done so and has not weaponized it. This apparently is the US red line. There have been several comments, most notably a little while ago by Secretary Panetta, that, I say to Iran, don't weaponize. This is the US red line. It's not Israel's red line, of course, but it seems to be the US red line. Of course, there's a range of possibilities as to what that looks like. What is an Iran that has solved most of the problems but not done it yet? And I'm not aware of too many good pieces of work that have looked at what that might look like, and that's probably a gap in the literature. I think some of the technical people are going to have to do that. So this question of the line is not that well defined, but that's what I take it to mean. In terms of deterrence, we have to recognize at the outset that there are going to be several things in play, and there's going to be more than two actors. This is not a US-Iran game. There are different actors with different needs. But if Iran is to approach but not cross the line, then deterrence is going to require a structure of trade-offs and understandings to sort of maintain Iran at that point. And the Iranians are going to want some things too, and that needs to be looked at. And it hasn't been looked at that much by most people who've written on this. Given the lack of dialogue and the lack of trust which exists between Iran and most of the international community that deals with this issue, it's going to be very difficult to find out what that will be and to structure that deal and to create that deal. And the last several years of discussions have shown us that. And moreover, there are going to be some on the various sides, both in Iran and in the States and in Israel and elsewhere, who aren't going to accept a deal. And so that's going to be a real problem, because if there's going to be a deal and it's going to endure over a long period of time of Iran being a latent nuclear power, bipartisanship is going to be an issue. And the current situation doesn't bode well for that. And as I said, this is not just a two-player game. Israel is going to have its concerns and needs, and they're going to be different from the Americans. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC countries, and so on. These different actors will have their own domestic audiences to reassure, and this will become part of the political dynamic in different places, and wider audiences, regional audiences, they have to be concerned about. And both of these, Israel and the GCC countries, are going to be keen to project an air of toughness as this happens, and so that's going to be an issue as well. So what I want to look at now is sort of what are, I think, the key drivers, or the key driver of Iran's nuclear program, and I contend it's a domestic politics argument. Secondly, the question of Iranian behavior and the whole issue of rationality, and do we understand rationality, and do they understand rationality, and so forth. And third, whether we can live with a nuclear-capable Iran, which I think on our side, and I mean our by the US, the West, general Israel, means giving up on notions of regime change. I think that's their bottom line in all this, and on their side, on our side, we'll have certain requirements of them. So let me talk a bit about domestic politics as the key driver of Iran's nuclear program. We tend to forget that the nuclear program was begun by the Shah, not by the present government, and it was not limited to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. It's pretty clear, and it was pretty clear then that he had other ambitions, but there wasn't much complaint about it at the time. Indeed, a lot of the nuclear infrastructure was provided to him by the use. I visited the famous Tehran research reactor, and I've talked to people in it, and it was given by the US originally. It's now full of parts that are marked made in the German Democratic Republic and other places like that, but it originally came from the United States. When the Islamic Republic first took over in 1979, they renounced the nuclear program as un-Islamic. It seems fairly clear that they did stop work, places like Bushehr and elsewhere. And it was only in the mid-'80s, after several years of bloody conflict with Iraq, no assistance from the international community, despite the fact that Iraq used CW in contravention of its obligations, and no one came to Iran's aid. And proof that Iraq was itself pursuing a nuclear program, that the Iranians resurrected their nuclear program. The succeeding years have seen a great deal of activity by Iran, a good deal of it clandestine, to develop capabilities which are, I think at best one can say, dual use, and foremost of which being enrichment, but not only enrichment, investigating triggering mechanisms and things like that. And so there's widespread agreement, I think, at least in the West, that Iran is at least attempting to produce the capability to have a nuclear weapon. There is a debate as to whether Iran has made the decision to cross the line. Most people that one reads, including the US intelligence community and most of the other intelligence communities in the West, take the view that Iran is seeking a capability but hasn't made the decision to cross the threshold. But again, what that means in practical terms is rather difficult to determine, particularly as they get closer to this imaginary line. What that means and how you assess it becomes difficult. So the question is, why is Iran pursuing this course? Well, a classic realist analysis would argue that Iran does so because it's an isolated country that lives in a rough neighborhood. Although, of course, it's isolated itself to a large extent, but that's not how they see these things. But a closer examination of Iran's program reveals that it's not been a sort of a steady, inexorable, aggressive march to a capability, as one would expect if security was the primary motivator. And there's a very good article in the current Foreign Affairs by Jacques Ayman called Botching the Bomb, in which he looks at some detail about this question of the meandering, inefficient course that they've taken so far. And so the twists and turns suggest there are drivers behind Iran's nuclear program, beyond classic security issues. And I contend, and I do so for reading the paper, I won't go into them now, but for reasons that have to do with domestic politics. And there are several reasons why Iran's elite has become committed to this nuclear program, even at great cost, beyond the deterrence issue, which I contend is the primary one. The first of these additional issues is internal wrangling for power among the different factions. I don't think it's appreciated generally in the West how factional Iranian politics is and how difficult it is. National and regional prestige. And finally, the opportunity for vast corruption that accompanies any large program in Iran. And I don't think that last point should be underestimated. I've had several Iranians tell me that the nuclear program is a huge slush fund, which has been used to reward a variety of people. And that may be one of the reasons why it's been so inefficient over the years, because it's been largely about that kind of thing going on in Iran. Excuse me. So this hypothesis suggests that there is an internal argument over sort of shifting political calculations of cost and benefit with respect to the nuclear program between the various groups and factions in Iran, and therefore there's scope for a deal in that zone. I think it's clear to me from my own engagement with many Iranians, I've talked to people from the Revolutionary Guards to the most dovish of foreign ministry people in Iran and everywhere in between, that enrichment is a red line. Too much credibility, both political and financial and capital, have been invested in this to back away from it. So whatever deal is signed is going to have to include, if only symbolically, recognition of Iran's right to enrich and a continuing uranium enrichment program. There's scope for discussion over how small that might be, how much it might be verified, and so on and so forth, but enrichment, I think, is their red line. So let me talk a bit now about Iranian culture and deterrence. The Iranian political system is very confused and very chaotic and very factional, and of course the nuclear program is primarily influenced by that system. So what does this say about possible future Iranian approaches to negotiation and to deterrence? It's often forgotten that deterrence, though practiced between foes, requires a relationship. In fact, it's a form of an ongoing negotiation that goes on between the countries involved in it. So what are likely to be Iranian thoughts about such a negotiation and how it would evolve? If you look at the way Iran negotiates and Iranian culture, and people like Limbert have looked at this in some detail, I've done some writing on it, there have been a few others, not as many as one would like in the West, but there have been a few. The Iranian culture of negotiation and discussion includes very elaborate formal language which is used to establish pecking orders, to pass unspoken messages. Concealment and dissimulation are part of this. They're not considered negative behavior, but a form of self-defense. There's a long history in Shiite culture of that. And while these characteristics may suit internal Iranian political life, and believe me, if you've dealt with Iranian diplomats and politicians, you see that all the time, they pose a serious problem for the development of a deterrent relationship which has to be based on clearly understood and shared understandings of behavior, primarily of so-called rational behavior. So it's necessary to consider this question of rationality. Deterrence really requires that both of the players be rational. And you have this argument between instrumental rationality and value rationality, and which is which, and obviously instrumental rationality is the one that leads to potentially to stability and so on. A second key to rationality in a deterrent situation is you have some sense that your adversary assesses things in a predictable way. And this, of course, gets into questions on perception. So the critical question in the Iranian case, if we're going to be engaged in a process of some sort of deterrence with them, is whether instrumental rationality and a predictable assessment of reality prevail in Tehran to a degree that we can place our trust in a certain course of action over the long term. Of the studies on Iran and deterrence which have been undertaken thus far, and I mentioned at the beginning there have been several, opinion is split. And it's essentially based on each author's basic perception of Iran's leadership and of Iranian political culture. As the former head of the U.S. Central Command, Abazai, put it, quote, "Iran is not a suicide nation. They may have some people in charge that don't appear rational, but I doubt the Iranians intend to attack us with a nuclear weapon," end quote. More recently, General Dempsey said something similar. The Israeli chief of staff said something similar. But then, of course, there are others, like Prime Minister Netanyahu and others, who make the point that we can't trust that. There are elements of the Iranian body politic that are messianic, that feel they have a religious mission, and so on. And can we put our Israel's survival in the hands of such people if they get access to a nuclear weapon? The argument being that we can't trust that they're going to be rational with this power over time. Well, apart from being a tautology, this second line of argument means that only regime change can assure security. Because the argument is, of course, that rogue states don't think the way we do and may be willing to accept casualties that sane people are not. And so you have people like the present Israeli ambassador to the U.S., used to be an academic, who's written things like, you know, some people in Israel feel that Iran would be willing to sort of sacrifice 50% of its population to destroy Israel. He offers not a shred of proof for this, it's just an assertion. So this question of rogues with nuclear arsenals has become a serious part of the discussion. Now, Jervis has written a paper recently critiquing this argument, but the idea is that even a small nuclear force in the hands of a rogue state is a far greater threat than was, for example, the Soviet Union, because the rogues are prepared to actually use these things. Even if they have few of them, they use them. Well, this whole argument stultifies the debate over whether deterrence is possible, because deterrence is ultimately a deal. We are deterring them, but they are also deterring us. And their goals may go beyond regime survival, but this survival has to at least be a basic goal. That must be basic, one of the most fundamental things that they want. And if we take regime survival off the table, then we remove their incentive to consider stable deterrence. Why should they bother? So the key to understanding of deterrence is that it is not just about dissuading an actor from certain courses of action by posing a threat, but also encouraging certain behaviors by promising not to exercise the threat if the opponent demonstrates restraint. And this argument that because they're a rogue, because they're not sane, we must change the regime, it takes all that off the table. So in the Iranian case, I think a need is going to exist on both sides to ask what these weapons are for, or more precisely what this weapon's capability is for, what the Iranians want. And this is going to be a very complicated discussion. For Iran, I believe it's going to be about deterring US and Israeli attacks designed to promote regime change, but I think it may also have other goals. One hears, for example, the fear that Iran may have more ambitious goals for its nuclear capability, such as a more aggressive, even messianic challenge to the regional order, emboldened approach to support for terror groups across the region, possibly even the transfer of nuclear material to such groups so they can use them and leave Iran apparently blameless. Let me take on those three fears right away, because I think they're not realistic. For example, the field of nuclear forensics, though far from perfect, means that an Iranian nuclear device or nuclear source device is ever used, it stands a good chance of being traced back to Iran, thereby inviting a devastating response. And even if the scientific proof is less than 100%, it seems to me, having been in government, very likely that Israel, the US, and others will come to the conclusion that the stuff was sourced from Iran as part of the assessment process under the circumstances of something actually having been used. Indeed, one element of deterring a future nuclear-capable Iran would be a clear statement that any future use of nuclear material in the region by a sub-state actor will implicate Iran by definition. And President Bush made a similar statement about North Korea the day when they let off their first nuclear device. It's also very unlike the Iranians to engage in reckless behavior. They talk a great deal, but their actual actions, if you look at them over time, are not reckless. They certainly don't want to invite people to attack them because of reckless behavior. I always like to say that Iran's Ayatollahs are great believers in the concept of martyrdom. They feel it's such a great honor, it's only to be bestowed upon others, primarily Lebanese Shiites. And they don't want it for themselves. There's no evidence they ever have. Iran does supply terror organizations with material, conventional material, but the resulting attacks are limited in scope, arm's length, and untraceable back to Iran. And moreover, suicide bombing is a serious issue, but it's not an existential threat. But a nuclear attack would be, and Iran knows the difference. It knows that it would be treated differently if it gave these materials to someone to use for an attack. So Iran supplies terrorists out of ideology, but also because they provide it with a form of a deterrent, a way to strike back at either Israel or the US if they were to attack Iran. But there's no evidence that Iran wants to endow these organizations with an independent capacity for mass destruction, especially one that could be traced back to Iran if it was ever used. As for the argument that nuclear Iran would engage in messianic behavior, this imagines that the Iranian leadership would commit suicide for a religious goal. As I said, his current Israeli ambassador to Washington has talked about this, and so have others. But for all its bluster, as I say, if you look at the actual record of Iranian action, it's fairly cautious and risk-averse. And as for the ideology, the concern that ideology will trump over common sense, David Menashri, Israel's foremost Iran expert, has said, quote, "Whenever ideological convictions have clashed with the interests of the state interests ultimately have superseded reactionary dogma in both foreign relations and domestic politics." And I agree with that. I think there's a fairly clear and consistent record of that. So I think that these sorts of ideas of Iran using nuclear weapons or giving this capability to terrorist groups are not really the true dangers that a nuclear-capable Iran poses. I think instead the problem plays out in more subtle and less tangible ways across the region. I think, for example, the danger to Israel is not so much an attack, but the knowledge on the part of the Israeli public that Iran has this capability. And I think that could affect the Israeli psyche over many years, causing people to emigrate rather than live with this, causing some who might wish to immigrate to Israel not to do so. And similarly, the threat to other countries in the region, the GCC countries, is that they will be more willing to accede to Iranian wishes rather than stand up to them. So the challenge is thus going to be not only deterring an Iranian nuclear capability, but also about such things as reputation and credibility in the face of these more subtle problems and more subtle threats. These are intangibles that mean different things to the US and Israel. And the US, of course, also has other regional goals around the world, and we'll be looking at the Iranian case in terms of its credibility in that sense. Fears of Iranian blackmail notwithstanding, on the other hand, I think many Iranian analysts note that Iran itself is not immune to pressure and will remain by far the weaker party in these various relationships. And so there will be nuclear learning going on in Iran. And I think a lot of Iranians I've spoken with who think about this, and they're not generally allowed to talk about it publicly, say, you know, I think we are going to, like a lot of other countries that went nuclear and thought it was going to be a great boon for us, realize it actually circumscribes our scope for action, it imposes certain discipline on us, and it's more expensive than we thought it would be, and all the different things that many countries who've gone nuclear have learned. Perhaps the greatest danger to stable deterrence is that conflict could be started by accident or miscalculation. I think that's a genuine concern in the region. And so the logical response, of course, would be a series of agreements to sort of mitigate this risk. And such arrangements were a feature of the Cold War, prevention incidents, things like that. Hotlines, facilitating communication in an emergency, and so on and so forth. It seems sensible, therefore, to suggest agreements between Iran's military forces and those of the US and others that operate in the Persian Gulf. And senior US leaders have done so, suggesting that they could be formal or they can even be tacit if Iran does not want to sign formal agreements with the US. And that would make a great deal of sense in terms of this problem of the potential for conflict by accident, particularly as Iran approaches the line. But I think that Iran has rejected these overtures, and I think it's going to continue to do so for at least three reasons. First, at the political level, the Iran rejects the validity of the US presence in the region per se. And so signing agreements, whether tacit or formal, with US forces in the region undermines that position. Secondly, the purpose of CBMs is to reduce the danger of unpredictable, or one of the purposes, is to reduce the danger of unpredictable and provocative actions leading to a conflict. But these are the very kinds of actions that Iran's irregular forces, the Revolutionary Guards, particularly the naval forces, rely upon. They cannot take on the US on a conventional level. So they've invested heavily in small, fast attack craft, equipped and trained for what they call asymmetric missions, sometimes known as swarming US and other Western warships, or otherwise acting in a provocative and erratic fashion around them. And to sign an agreement saying we won't do these things, which is the essence of one of these incidents at sea agreements, fundamentally undercuts the only strategy the Iranians think they have as the weaker power. And finally, I think Iran will be unwilling to assuage US concerns over accidental conflict if it thinks the US is not prepared to accept Iran's security concerns. There's a sense in Tehran that many people from across the spectrum that I've talked to over the years say that we don't believe that the US, Israel, other countries will ever really recognize Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy or what we regard in Iran as our legitimate security needs. And recent sanctions legislation passed by the Congress appears to bear this out in that it greatly restricts diplomatic exchanges between Iran and the US over the nuclear issue, but all other diplomatic matters until Iran abandons a wide range of activities just beyond the nuclear program. So, demanding that what the other side abandon its position before talks can commence is hardly the basis of diplomacy. And I think it may also strike Iranian leaders as somewhat strange to enter into negotiations for confidence-building measures when their scientists are being killed on the streets of Tehran and mysterious explosions are rocking their military bases. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I think that's the mindset in Tehran. The answer, of course, is that CBMs were never meant to stop competition between antagonistic countries, just meant to try and regulate that competition so it doesn't get out of hand. But I think the Iranians are going to have difficulty seeing it that way, at least for the first decade or so of their entry into the near-nuclear club. And that's going to be a dangerous time, therefore, as this learning goes on. Whatever we call it. I'm still working on the term to give the name to that club. So the calculus in Tehran, I think, is going to be that sort of making it easier and less risky for U.S. forces to operate in the Persian Gulf in the absence of a U.S. recognition of Iran's rights and needs simply helps the U.S. to threaten Iran without any benefit to Iran. So if the U.S. wants a stable military relationship with a nuclear-capable Iran, I think it's going to have to start addressing this concern. And that's something that the U.S. is going to have to wrap its mind about by primarily taking regime change off the table. And I think that may be one of the underlying motives for the Iranian program. Just a few more points. In the meantime, Israel is going to be thinking about existential issues, about the need to show toughness if its deterrent is to be effective. And in this context, years of rhetoric from the Israeli political elite that a nuclear-capable Iran will not be allowed is going to greatly weaken Israel's credibility in the region if Iran does, in fact, achieve that status. So might Israel in these circumstances believe it needs to act with particular toughness to restore its credibility? And how will that impact what America might want to do in the region to try and reduce tension? It's going to be a difficult situation. Another point, and I know this is somewhat controversial, I always get jumped on Israel when I say this, but in discussing Israeli views on deterring a nuclear-capable Iran, I think one also has to note that Israel conceives of its deterrent as a shield behind which to engage unilaterally in military actions against others in the region when it feels it must. And so Israel's conception of deterrence requires that it be the region's only nuclear-capable state, whereas classical deterrence posits two nuclear-armed states deterring each other. So when Israel says it's unwilling to be placed in a situation having to deter a nuclear-capable Iran, what it's really saying is that it refuses to accept the reality of an antagonistic regional state over which it does not retain an overwhelming unilateral advantage. I think that's what we're hearing. And that's not the same thing as deterrence properly understood. So I think the key challenge for Israel in all this is going to be learning how to live in a situation of deterrence for the first time. That's the issue for Israel. Another issue arising from the idea of a nuclear-capable Iran would be the consequences on proliferation. And so we've heard a great deal from many people about this idea of a proliferation cascade across the Middle East. I question this. There's a lot of scholarship now and studies of the record which questions the assumptions about reactive proliferation cascades in the world. In fact, the reality is that proliferation is not the norm but the exception in terms of international behavior. Even when confronted with serious challenges, including nuclear-armed rivals, most states find other ways to assure their security. And so it suggests that here, too, the responses to the challenge posed by a nuclear-capable Iran should be considered in more measured terms than some of the apocalyptic rhetoric suggests. A nuclear-capable Iran will undoubtedly cause significant disquiet in the region, there's no question of that. But a resulting proliferation cascade is not certain. The metaphor of a cascade, I think, is also rather incorrect because it's sort of, a rapid waterfall, things happening very quickly. But in reality, any response to an Iranian near-nuclear capability will take decades to play out. Countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, if they wanted to go nuclear, it would take them a very long time. And there will be ample time to change course. So let me make a few concluding points, and then I'll stop talking. So first of all, if Iran does acquire a nuclear weapons capability, and if it wants a stable relationship with the West and with Israel and the region and so forth, it must make up its mind what it wants from its deterrent, and it must communicate that very clearly. A minimum deterrent decided to provide assurance of regime survival is the least destabilizing position. A deterrent intended to serve more adventurous goals will create serious problems, both for those seeking to deter Iran and, I would argue, for the Iranians themselves. Stable deterrence requires that the parties understand the red lines. The accumulated experience with deterrence that we have over many years is that it works when the players get to know each other and develop trust that actions will be predictable and dependable. And here the experience of the Cold War is a little disturbing. Although we think it was a stable time, a lot of studies are coming out now that, in fact, we didn't really understand one another that well. And there were moments when there were real dangers beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War. So this question of a stable relationship, a stable deterrent relationship based upon understanding the red lines is very difficult to actually achieve. And the experience of the Cold War is not necessarily helpful in that sense. But the problem that we're going to face with the question of Iran is that the nature, I think, of the Iranian psyche and negotiating behavior and the nature of the Iranian regime itself makes it likely that this is going to be difficult, particularly in the early stages of Iran's entry into this club, whatever we call it, which will be confused and obscure, particularly if Iran does not declare a weapon. Iranians need to be straightforward with their adversaries and willing to talk to them. But if past behavior of the Iranian regime and of the Iranian domestic political scene is any indication, it seems likely that the various factions in Iran are going to inflate rhetoric, play games, seek to confuse both each other and the international community. And so the idea of an ongoing dialogue with the US and others to clarify objectives and stabilize the situation is going to be seen by many players in Tehran as a favor to be granted to Washington in return for good behavior rather than a vital Iranian interest. And that's going to be a very serious problem in terms of managing this transition. Meanwhile, from the Iranian viewpoint, there are a lot of people in Iran who question whether they can ever really trust that the US and Israel will take regime change off the table if Iran accepts some restraints on itself as a near-nuclear power. The American messaging on that is going to have to be clear, bipartisan, and long-term. And of course, current US politics doesn't bode particularly well for that. And Israel, again, may have a different approach, even if the US does come to a set of understandings with a nuclear-capable Iran. So in my mind, the real question that we face is the transition from a diplomatic and political strategy of the last 20-odd years, which has been designed to deny Iran access to a nuclear weapons capability, to one that grudgingly accepts it and seeks both to engage Iran and to deter it simultaneously. And that transition is going to be excruciatingly difficult for both sides, or for all sides. Different imperatives are in play in the two strategies, and different messages are being simultaneously sent to different audiences. And the US, Israel, and the GCC will all be making this shift, but will have slightly different goals and activities. So my final point is that ultimately, successful deterrence requires dialogue. It requires the building of a long-term relationship. And so even as the international community continues to seek to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear capable, it also needs to begin to think about ways to engage an Iran that is approaching that line. The Iranian political system, on its part, needs to develop the internal political consensus and, frankly speaking, maturity that will permit a dialogue to begin and be sustained. And I don't see much evidence of that at the present time. But this will be a long-term problem. And so even as ongoing efforts seek to deny Iran a nuclear capability, there's a need to consider how to open up avenues for a dialogue that will be a necessary component of deterring a nuclear-capable Iran. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I know I see Hafner and Philip, and okay, just a second, let me try to Brian,
This usually
Fred,
gets a lot of comments.
and Ray. To start us off here, and I want to encourage our students also to ask questions here. But why don't we start with you, Avner, and then we'll maybe you can also just start a pattern of introducing yourself so that.
Well, we know each other.
I know you do, but there are people who are, this is being filmed, and there are other people around the room who may not yet associate the name with your great reputation.
I'm Cohen, I'm a professor here and senior fellow here at CNS. It was very interesting to listen to you, Peter, and it's kind of ongoing discussion that we have had for years. In fact, I think that you referred to the talk in Tel Aviv. I was there when you started with all that. I find myself sympathetic with almost everything you said, and yet I believe that somehow, in a fundamental way, the paper and the focus is misplaced, and let me explain that. I think you put enormous emphasis, much more than required, conceptually speaking, on the category of nuclear-capable state, nuclear-capable Iran. I think, in my conceptualization, the fight between Iran and the rest of the world is not about capability. It's more specific. It's about how closely or how far Iran will be allowed, or how specifically, how much latent Iran will be allowed to be close to the bomb. It's not about the bomb. It's clear that right now, under the present trajectory, Iran is not going to have the bomb. Iran will have the bomb openly only if it's going to be attacked. But it's about the distance. Iran would like to blur and to continue as much as they can. The world, Israel would like to stop them as early as possible, especially Israel, some more and more element of capabilities. But I think that the issue of deterrence is not about use. I fully agree with you, but this is not the issue. Iran, I take very seriously Barack Obama claims that he would not allow Iran, that in terms of, we're not going to talk about containment, that he would not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. I take it very, very seriously. Neither the United States nor Israel would allow it to come to that. The question is, how credible would be the American or Israelis or both red line vis-a-vis Iran to deter Iran from crossing them, moving further and further towards the bomb, not necessarily having the bomb. So the question is, as you said, the issue of weaponization, it's not easily to draw the line. So the real issue is to prevent them to go from further, and that's the deterrence. The deterrence is not about using the bomb. And I think that you give them enormous amount of strategic role by giving them that status, near nuclear weapons or nuclear capable. But this is not really the issue. I think that you overstate an issue which is not really the issue. The issue is how close they will be to the bomb and whether we will have the timely warning. So that's and I think the stability of the deterrence is against that being able to prevent Iran to make those kind of decisions. As you know, there is a big debate about what decision that they have made. The decision to have capability, or decision to have the bomb, or whether the question of moving from capability to the bomb is just a tactical issue until the appropriate time will be found, the convenient time to cross that kind of things. So it seems to me, even though I agree with almost everything you're saying, that the focus is somewhat misplaced, and you don't raise what I think the right questions.
Okay, thanks, After. Do you want to, why don't we, I think we have enough time, at least initially, to try to respond to the questions as they are directed at you, and then if we get, we're running short of time, then we'll collect questions.
Okay. Well, Avner and I have a tradition of being in what I like to call violent agreement. We have this sort of funny tennis match that goes on over the year where one of us says something that says, well, you're about right, but I disagree with that because, and then we explore it and find out we're largely in agreement, in fact, but we go at it to get there. I, in turn, agree with most of what you say. But I think that you say that, it's not about whether Iran will be allowed to have a weapon or not. I tend to agree with that. It's about how close will they be allowed to get. I tend to agree with that. I think there are a whole series of issues, and I said at the beginning of the paper that we haven't done, at least to my knowledge, a lot of work on what this near nuclear capability looks like and what's acceptable and what isn't and what the red lines are. And I think that's the stuff of hopefully the stuff of the talks that are going on now. Meanwhile, Israel, of course, is helpfully saying the definition is no enriched material, shutting down this and that, and that's the, but I think obviously the U.S. and the P5+1 have moved beyond that. The question of how credible are U.S. and Israeli threats to prevent Iran from having the bomb, which I think was the crux of your thing. If I was an Iranian sitting here, it's always dangerous to say if I was an Iranian, but let me turn that around and I would say, well, you never asked what I want to be stopped in order to stop at a certain point. Let's talk about that. And they will often, I've negotiated with Iranians as an official, and it's a very long process, and you'll have a long period of time of Persian culture and history and respect and justice and so on and so forth, but I think what it comes down to is regime change. So I think the deal to be made is, and historical analogies are always dangerous, so let me make one. I mean, at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, no nukes in Cuba for a guarantee you won't invade us. And I think that part of this deal is you're going to have to learn to accept us as the government of Iran and stop it with nascent, latent hopes of regime change, which you've never given up on, the Iranians would say. And once we feel that that is something that has really become internalized as part of your policy, then we'll talk about where we'll stop at what point along the spectrum they'll stop. And I think they also understand that if they were to make a sprint, the famous sprint for the bomb, you know, if they were to pull out all the stops, they could make a sprint for it in a year. I think there's a pretty good recognition in Iran that they'd be detected during that time, and they know they'd be thumped. So, you know, this is not going to happen. So we may well end up living in a world where they are perpetually a year from the bomb, and we do some agreements so that they stay there, or 18 months, or whatever the definition may be. And we have the additional protocol and perhaps some other verification mechanisms to assure us that we can monitor that in return for some political accommodations that, you know, we have traditionally proved unwilling to make. So again, I think we're in violent agreement here. But what I wanted to do with this paper was, because this is really not discussed in this way often in the Western literature, to sort of try and introduce some of these notions into the debate.
Thanks, Peter. I'm sure we can carry on this exchange, but let's move on and bring in some other folks. Dr. Blake.
Sure. Philip Blake. I teach here as well in the Nonproliferation Terrorism Studies program. So let me try to be provocative and see if I can get violent agreement as well. So first attempt at I'll have two questions. The first one is, why do you have to take regime change off the table? So if what you're trying to deter is nuclear use, and I'll get to that in the second question, why can't you say to Iran, you use a nuclear weapon and there will be severe consequences, including potentially the use of nuclear weapons against you, and by the way, we're going to keep funding various kinds of organizations that are going to try to topple your regime. Like, I get why you might end up there as a policy recommendation, but I don't get why it's a requirement. And the second question is, why focus on nuclear use? Especially when you're pitching your article as saying you're assuming that Iran will not have a deployed nuclear capability. You're assuming that it's well shy of that. And isn't that a bit of a straw man? It's a straw man that lots of Israelis and others are articulating, including the ambassador. But isn't the real fear kind of the Saddam strategy, which is Iranian nuclear weapons embolden Iran. They take the Israeli nuclear weapons off the table and embolden Iran to a kind of a host of more provocative actions that in the absence of those nuclear weapons it wouldn't feel comfortable engaging in. And if that's the deterrence relationship, it seems to me the dialogue is very different than the kind of red line, don't do the absolute suicidal, crazy thing and use nuclear weapons against Israel.
Yeah. Okay. Let me respond to that.
Sure.
Okay. Let me just get it
Give you
here.
a chance to.
All right. Why do you have to take regime change off the table? I think, you know, based upon my trips to Iran, my work with a lot of Iranians over the years, it's not a question of me taking regime change off the table. I think that's what they want. I think that's the regime. I mean, the people are different. The Iranian people would be quite happy with regime change, or many of them. But the regime itself, the people who are making these decisions, and I mean, Ayatollah Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards, that is their bottom line, I think. And so it's not a question of me taking regime change off the table. I think that in any sort of serious discussion of a long-term, stable deterrent relationship, which is where I get into this business of, you know, confidence-building measures to reduce the possibility of accidental conflict, which I think is the most dangerous possibility, at least for the next few years, and other things like that. I think that's what they're going to be looking for in order to go down that path to create a set of agreements and understandings that I associate with a more stable deterrent relationship. So it's not a question of me, it's a question of what they want. I think if they perceive that regime change remains a goal for the US, for the West, for Israel, they're going to be more likely to engage in some practices with this, quote, near nuclear capability, or to threaten to engage in those practices as what they view as a deterrent. And so that is my sort of understanding of the basic deal. In terms of focusing on nuclear use, I mean, I agree with you in the sense that it is something of a straw man, but it's one that gets talked about a lot. It is the most public thing, and as I say in the paper, and I go into more detail in the paper, these other more subtle threats and concerns are, I think, really what this is all about. But nevertheless, and I wanted to get into this question of would nuclear weapons embolden Iran, potentially, and that's the other thing that one hears. And my gut feeling, and I have no more proof to back this up than those who say, yes, it would, and they would do this and that, and they'd give nuclear materials to terrorists, is that they will talk about that. And that is going to be, as I said in the paper, that's going to be a cause of concern for us all, and heighten the tension in the region. But I think over time, many of the Iranians I've talked to have said, you know, we're going to have to learn that if you are in this situation and you want to be perceived as being a near-nuclear state and so on, you actually have to stop doing that kind of thing. You have to grow up and become more mature. So that's a difficult piece of learning they're going to have to go through, but it's going to take some time. And the nature of the Iranian body politics is such that it sort of militates against that kind of thing, because, you know, if all politics is local, the Iranians can teach, Tip O'Neill, I believe, was the author of that statement, they can teach him a thing or two about all politics being local. The factional rivalries and debates that go on in Tehran, and the fact that these weapons or this potential will be used as a part of that by hardliners and different groups is going to make it rather difficult for them to get to that point. So the question of actual nuclear use is probably a straw man, I agree with that, but it's going to be discussed a lot by both sides for the foreseeable future, and therefore I think it needs to be dealt with as part of dealing with the other more subtle threats as well.
Brian?
Sure, I'm Brian Lee. I direct the Eurasian Nonproliferation program here. I have a question when you're talking about deterrence, and you use these kind of ideas, things like Cold War style, agreements and mechanisms and things like that. How do you account, or how do you envision the role of the other players? I mean, what do you think Europe's role is going to be in this deterrence argument? What do you think Russia's role is going to be? Because it seems to me you've posited pretty much kind of a U.S.-Israel against Iran type of situation. I think the world has become a lot more complex than that with this situation.
And to just kind of add to that, it was rather striking at the NPT PrepCom last week and the week before, that in their opening statement, the only member of the P5 that Iran really hammered was France. I think to a large extent because initially the U.S. didn't mention Iran in its opening statement, but there seemed, and this was kind of repeated in a variety of debates, at the PrepCom. So it would be just to kind of amplify on the point that you kind of discussed this primarily as a U.S.-Iranian issue, and there are other players, including other nuclear weapon states.
Yep, there are. And they also historically have a tendency to go after Britain, rhetorically, more so than the U.S. in different fora because of the history of during the Shah's day. I mean, you raise a very interesting point, and it's something that I'm still coming to grips with. I don't think we know what the shape of the world is going to be like in terms of, I think you're quite right to raise the point, and I discussed it in a bit more detail in the paper, but not much, frankly. And that's partly because the Iranians are obsessed by the United States. They view the U.S. as the only threat to their regime and to the Islamic Republic. Relations with other countries are important, but they tend to view them through the prism of what that means for their relationship with the United States, and to a lesser extent Israel, so the great Satan and the little Satan. So my sense is that for at least the first few years, as this process of nuclear learning is taking place, with respect to the issues I'm talking about in the paper, the primary concern of the Iranians will be the U.S. and to a lesser extent Israel. I think for the Americans, there are going to be issues with regard to Europe and Russia and these other kind of, how they will constrain or perhaps facilitate American actions. And I confess I haven't really thought that through. I was thinking more about the Iranian side of this in this paper. But I think for the Iranians, it's going to be primarily about the U.S., at least for the first decade or so of their nuclear experience.
Thank you. Fred.
Fred Whalen, Chair of the Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies Program. Peter, I'd like to renounce both violence and agreement by arguing that Iran, the main condition for deterrence and renunciation of hopes for regime change, is impossible, undesirable, and unnecessary. And I think if we look at a wide variety of deterrence relationships, and going far before nuclear deterrence, we see a relationship where both sides agree tacitly or more openly to refrain from state-destroying or regime-changing offensive action, whether that would be nuclear or by conventional means, while at the same time continuing to act adventurously in order to, in small, incremental ways, enhance their position vis-a-vis one another or in their region or even in the world, but at the same time entertaining a long-term strategy of regime change, particularly when the regimes are defined by ideological differences. And the US and the USSR is a classic example. That's a perfect example of how a deterrence relationship did not preclude hope for regime change. One can argue that the US was incredibly successful in its long-term strategy of bringing out regime change, and that there are strategic, political, moral, and ethical reasons why both sides, again, look from, whether you look from Tel Aviv or Tehran or Washington, that's exactly the kind of strategy that will work internally as well as externally. Now, will that be a scenario of instability? Again, we have to recall that we could expect all sides to, again, act with more assertively, whether it's more the kind of military operations Israel undertakes, or whether Iran might begin militarily, politically, to become putting more pressure on the GCC. But that strikes me as a possibility, maybe the only possibility, for a stable deterrence relationship.
I'm not sure I completely agree with you in the sense that, first of all, with respect to the Soviet case, I don't necessarily think that the US brought about regime change. I think the Soviet Union collapsed from within. The US held a line and prevented its expansion, perhaps, but it collapsed from within. And I think the same will happen in Iran. I don't see the Islamic Republic surviving over the long term. Having gone there many times over a couple of decades, the situation is getting worse.
And if I may, it's completely reasonable, again, from an Iranian point of view, to say that Israel will not survive in the long term, looking at demographics or whatever else.
They may say that. I think Israel has a better
Not
chance.
that I would say that.
I think
yeah.
Israel has a better chance than the Islamic Republic. Not Iran, but the Islamic Republic. At this, that would be my assessment. But when it'll happen and how it'll happen, much like with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Arab Spring, will take us all by surprise. We'll study it to death, and it'll take us by surprise when it actually happens. But what I mean about renouncing regime change is not renouncing the desirability of a different government in Iran. We will all continue to wish for a different government. But renouncing the idea that we will act on that in a decisive way. They may be nibbling around the margins, but that we will actually, the Iranians fear that there is the potential for an attack by the US aimed at regime change. And they've been encouraged to think that by sort of by the Bush administration, and you know, you're next on our list, we got these, we got these. Rightly or wrongly, they feel that that's a concern. So what I meant was sort of renouncing that the idea that this is a policy that the country intends to act upon. That, I think, is what they're looking for in that sense. And I think that's, and that doesn't mean to say that one cannot continue to have an antagonistic relationship. I think that one of the things that I find frustrating, particularly in Washington, is there's this, you either want to trounce the Islamic Republic or you are some ill-informed, naive Khomeini lover. There's no middle ground. I think that we can dislike them and we can continue to sort of have an antagonistic relationship while taking the idea of regime change as an act of policy off the table. And I think that's what they're looking for. I am not sure I'd put the Iranians in the same category as the North Koreans. I think the Iranians are unlikely to give up the option, but unlike the North Koreans, they're not likely to go ahead and build one and test it unless they perceive they have no other option. And they know that the dangers that would, you know, in terms of attack and so on. So I don't think it's a question. I mean, I think with North Korea, we're dealing with a country that has nuclear weapons. In Iran, we're not. With a program and an attention and a desire to develop capability. This question of regime change is possible. Yes, I suppose it is, but what are you willing to pay for that? I mean, can you persuade the American people to sign up to another long, difficult war in that part of the world? I have no faith whatsoever in the sort of the MEK and the Royalists, all these groups that wander around Washington saying, take us off the terror list and there'll be a huge change. What will be a change is they'll be able to raise money more openly. There will be no change in Iran. I mean, I've been to people's houses in Tehran who were, in the Green Movement, who are now in jail or had been in jail, and I have never heard one of them say, if only the MEK was taken off the terror list, there'd be change in Iran. I mean, it ain't gonna happen. They really are not that influential in the country. So, yeah, I mean, regime change is always, regime change in the Soviet Union was possible. Were we willing to actually, regime change in Czechoslovakia in 68 and Hungary 56 was not only possible, it was happening. Were we willing to step in and make it a reality? We weren't when the time came. So, I mean, the answer to your question is yes. And all these sort of neocons, and I know some of those people, and I've worked with them when I was in government and all the rest of it, and they always say, we could do this, it's possible. But you always say, well, that's nice, what are you willing, what do you think you can persuade the American people to do, to sort of pay the price to make that happen? And the conversation usually ends there, frankly. And I see this as more of the same. I mean, I think that, again, I think that the Islamic Republic will collapse of its own accord. I think it's fundamentally out of step with the desires of the majority of the Iranian people. I think that when Khatami was in power there, I mean, he was, again, historical analogies, dangerous things. I mean, he sort of, the desire was to reform the system, not to change it. And he was not even given permission to do that by the system. And so I think those days are long gone now. I think that what's coming is change. It'll be violent and difficult, and we won't know. And it won't necessarily lead to an Iran we'll like any better, quite frankly. But I'm not sure we, the West, particularly the US, is willing to pay the price to get there. Many people say they'd like to. They say it can be done easily. I don't think that's true.
Thanks, Peter. Bob?
Yes, I'm Bob Montgomery. I'm a member of the CNS Advisory Board. The only aspect of the analysis, or the one that most strikes me as problematic, is the element of negotiation. And I just wonder whether you think it might be possible to actually achieve the same results through unilateral statements by both sides without any agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, reciprocal unilateralism. Yes, but that's going to have to be backed up by some understandings of what that actually means in practice, which will require some talks.
You think
Now,
so, as opposed to simply
I think so.
statements?
I think the levels of mistrust are so great, and I think that the misunderstandings are considerable, given the fact that there's been no diplomatic exchange of any significance since 1979. And I think the suspicions are such that both sides, particularly the US, are going to say it's not enough to have them say this and we'll say that and that's enough. They're going to want some understandings of what that actually means. So I think we are going to have to, if this kind of a relationship that I'm positing in this paper is going to happen over time, it's going to have to be some fairly well demarcated agreements, whether they're done in formal negotiations or track 1.5, how is a different issue, but there'll have to be some discussions.
Peter, let me ask a question that you really haven't alluded to in your presentation, but I'm kind of fascinated by it, and I don't have a good understanding of how the fatwa about basically depicting a nuclear weapon as contrary to Islam, evil. It's been reiterated. Assuming there is some substance to the fatwa, how does that impact on the bureaucratic politics associated with different factions who may be advocating, for whatever reason, movement along different nuclear weapons paths? I mean, it's kind of confusing. I mean, and I know there are great disagreements, in the Western intelligence world, as well as others, about how much importance to attach to this. But it would seem to me that it has to have some kind of a bearing on how different factions make the case for doing this, that, or the other things. I don't really have a good feel for this. I'd be curious if you could could kind of speak to that issue.
Yeah, fatwas are, sort of, it's like the Bible, you can open it up and find anything you want. I mean, fatwas for this and that and so on. There's one against nuclear weapons has been fairly strongly made by the Supreme Leader and repeated. As it's been explained to me by several people, both in Iran and elsewhere, there's a fatwa against having and using them. There's no fatwa against getting close and exploring, which is a rather cynical way of looking at it, but so that would be the realist argument. There are also fatwas dealing with self-defense and the need for Iran as the sort of the bastion of Shiite and Persian culture to be able to defend itself from all foreign enemies and so on, and to have the capability to do so. So there's that kind of set of issues. I think, politically speaking, in my mind, and again this is an interpretation, others may disagree with it, I think it tends to strengthen the case if you believe that it is significant. And I do, but I don't know by how much. For this argument that they'll go to a certain point but not build one, unless threatened, or they feel that they find themselves in a situation such as when Saddam used chemical weapons and they had no response and no one came to their aid. I mean, then a fatwa could be issued quite quickly about self-defense. But to build one and to test it and to declare openly that one is a nuclear state, as North Korea and India and Pakistan have done, would be seen as undercutting the legitimacy of the Supreme Leader in a profoundly political way, both within Iran and abroad. And realists will say, well, that doesn't matter, there's just a bunch of liars, they'll do. I'm not sure that's true, in the sense that there is a certain desire to preserve what they regard as a reputation as a champion of the developing world, and you know, if the U.S. is an unjust liar, we in fact justice and truth and all that. And so I think that my interpretation of it, and many others have different interpretations, is it tends to lend credence to this idea of close but not over the line, and that squares with our religious obligations for the time being, subject to change if we need to.
Thank you.
Which is not a very exact answer, and others will disagree with it, but that's my interpretation.
Okay. Any other questions here for Peter? Okay, Peter, that was fascinating. I am sure that the discussions that we had today will continue, whether in a violent fashion or not. But I think it really was very useful to hear your presentation. We look forward to reading it in the Nonproliferation review shortly, and maybe there'll even be rejoinders that are submitted. But please join me in thanking our speakers.